All right. I don't know how to do transitions. I'm still trying to figure out what buttons. So I will get better at this, I promise, as I stream. But we're live now. Thanks for joining
Okay.
us on a special edition of Esports and Coffee. Today we have Chris Postel from Esports Foundry and the much waited, anticipated trends in collegiate esports. Thank you for coming on our stream and wanting to present it with us. We are very grateful that you wanted to do that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on here, Jackie. It's a real pleasure to be on the stream. Long time lurker, first time participant, I suppose.
How many years have you done the trends in collegiate esports? What year is this?
So this is the fourth year. What we're about to announce. We first started researching in 2019, 2020, um, and announced the 2020 version was volume one, so to speak. And this year we're releasing data that culminates through December of 2023, um, and that will be the fourth volume. So we've made it 4 years.
I think everyone in this space really just appreciates the amount of work that you put into this for all of us because it's real data, statistics that everyone always wants. And I know personally that I really appreciate the amount that you do to it.
Well,
Um,
thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, it really started off with um, when I got back into esports at that time. I realized that there was no actual data on our space and what it is that we were doing. Everything was anecdotal or it existed in the same newspaper clipping about, older esports programs that started back in 2015 or 2016, and everyone was just pointing back at them. But, here we were 5 years later and there was nothing new to really add to that conversation. So um, sometimes you just be the change you want to see in the world and you give it a shot. And that's all we've really done is just give it a shot.
well, thank you. I'm going to switch us over when it's going to be really seamless. Ready? Nope, it
Sounds
wasn't.
good.
There it was. I'm going to get it one of these days. Okay, so you take it away, and I'm just going to be your clicker. And we will be
All righty.
taking a Q&A afterwards. So if people want to put their questions in the Twitch chat, we'll get to those at the very end.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Jackie. Well, and to all the viewers, thank you so much for listening to this. If you have any questions about this presentation, drop them in the Twitch chat, and we'll get to them at the end. Hopefully, we can have a really good interactive Q&A and discussion. So, without further ado, Jackie, let's get started, shall we? Let's start moving through some of these slides.
All right. Here you go.
All right, thank you. So my name is Chris. I am the executive director of Vanguard under Esports Foundry, one of the sister companies that we own and operate. For those of you who don't know, Esports Foundry is a provider here in the space. We do a whole lot of different things, whether it's owning and operating and building gaming centers. We're one of the few organizations that does that. I lead our events and broadcasting department, which is Vanguard. Travel all over the country, doing all sorts of events for Scholastic and otherwise. We also have just launched our creative agency Pixabay, where we do a lot of 3D modeling work. We do a lot of marketing work, a lot of web design work, app development, and other things of that nature. And then we have other verticals that some of you may be familiar with, like esports gear and others. So we own our own factory in Las Vegas, and we actually produce jerseys made in the United States for over 700 high schools and colleges. But today we're talking about trends, and we've got four people on our team. Myself, Krishna Narayan, who is the guy that does all the data development and synthesization of all the surveys that we do and collect. Callie Chu is the designer and formatter of what will be released and what will be seen, and what has been done in the past. And then Josh Baker has also been very instrumental in helping build out not only the website for Esports Foundry and the Trends Report, but some of the past iterations. And I just thought it's really important to say it's more than myself and say thank you to all the wonderful people that are part of this process. So let's go into the next slide. Cool. So why does the Trends Report matter? That's a personal question for each person, but I like to define it three ways. Um, This is, to my knowledge, one of the only repositories in Scholastic Esports that has been requested and downloaded, viewed, and read literally thousands of times over the course of its lifetime, not just in North America by students or directors or administrators or third parties or investors or people who have no idea about esports at all, but also foreign governments, foreign entities, foreign universities, foreign students, research, all over the place. It's really been incredible to see who takes a look at the data and who wants it. Um, we've built. I'd like to brag and say we have a reputation at this point. Everything that we do, whether it's a survey or an interview or data analysis, um, it really we make no declarative anecdotal statements in these reports. We're very neutral in our stances more often than not. Um, and so we just try to present the data, and it's really important that it's trusted, it's trustworthy, and so that's what we try to be. And lastly, it matters because this is really made for those enthusiasts and directors that need these answers when they're asked to provide solutions for perspectives of this world that we live in, and they need to go deeper than something that's anecdotal or article based. So that's why we do it. And we'll move on to the next slide. All right. So a couple of bits of important pieces of news to get out of the way. The report is launching this month, and if I'm not mistaken, it may in fact even be coming out this week. Um, you can find the report, like all versions of our work, on esportsfoundry.com's website. And I'll be happy to say that we're actually making it automatic this year. I don't no longer have to manually send it out to everyone who requests it. Fun fact, if you ever gotten it, it was because I sent that email. We don't automate it up until this point. We have two ways that we're doing the report this year based on a lot of feedback and how we've seen the report being used in the past. We've seen a lot of people monetizing the report for their own purposes or using data um, for their own purposes and other things like that. But we also acknowledge that we've spent at this point thousands of hours working on it to put it out. So this year we're going to try to recoup some of those costs and kind of protect Esports Foundry from sometimes what other third-party consultants may otherwise be using this for. And so the full version will be sold at a very small price. And furthermore, to keep that information democratized, every copy that gets bought equals one donated copy to an esports club or a program that may not have budget to buy it. And then likewise, we're also donating proceeds of those profits to Voice, which is a nonprofit member-driven organization here in our ecosystem. We really support their messaging and their core values. And so we're going to be making them a donation based on the revenues that come from that as well. And for those who can't afford it or don't want to pay for it, we have a light version for the first time ever. It reads like a magazine, so it doesn't read like a 3-paragraph essay that's hundreds of pages long. So if you like pictures, you like stats, you know exactly what you're looking for. You want to give your director or your administrator just the Spark Notes versions that they can look at it and be like, oh, okay. Then the light version is for you 100%. But this year we've literally put together nearly 300 pages worth of data. Over 86 unique types of data have been sourced and parsed and analyzed to bring you what will be the 4th iteration of this report. So there's a lot of really positive things to look forward to coming out here. And we'll move on to the next slide. All right, we're going to start off with a couple of really declarative statements here. What is collegiate esports today? There's a lot of different ways to define it. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. But I think it's really important to look at what we're doing in Scholastic, not just as esports pertains to competition, but we'll talk more throughout this time about how esports and gaming is also part of that conversation. But what we can start with are truisms, and these are factoids that are declaratively true across the sample population of North America and Canada. There are over 750 esports programs across the United States right now. Those are greater than the amount that we see on Twitter. for sure. There is a huge number of programs that you'll never even know about that have 4 people, that have 10 people, that don't even have varsity teams, that have many different components to them. Um, but they're all university supported, they're funded, they have an FTE or an administrator that stand behind them, and they offer some form of incentive or benefit to the students that are backed by their institution. 55% of on-campus students across the United States and Canada identify as gamers, and we've used that data that tracks back all the way through PhD level studies that came out of both the University of Kentucky and the University of Central Florida, back in 2016 and 2017 respectively. So we know that 55% of those students identify as gamers in some way, shape, or form, meaning that they play games. They would identify themselves as a gamer, but the proclivity of how far down that rabbit hole they go, we don't know that answer. But we also know that 66 or 2/3 percent of participating students in this ecosystem that we have are STEM or STEM adjacent, which is huge. And that's allegorically true for many of us in this room here today. What you may not know is that collegiate esports as a micro industry of itself, based on our numbers of whom we have that are part of gaming clubs and part of esports programs, represent over $1 billion in tuition-based revenue every year coming from those students. That's not to say that esports is responsible for $1 billion of tuition-based revenue, but we had to throw in the B word once we realized that the research shows that, yeah, this is an impactful size of our industry, and we have grown to where the actions of our initiatives that have been built over the years are making an impact that are far greater than what we may be assuming or what we may be talking about. Lastly, just some numbers on the right. Our estimates within a margin of error, keep in mind, are that there's about 167,000 enrolled students in gaming clubs, esports and gaming clubs. Remember that statement, esports and gaming. And likewise, there are about 120,000 students that are enrolled within esports programs as a whole. That doesn't mean those are the numbers of competitive students. That means those are the numbers that are enrolled in programs as a whole. Notably, that number is smaller than the 167K number, and there is overlap between those two. So we can't add them up and say almost 300. That's not how we do it, but we can definitely break out the two. So let's move on to the next slide and start diving into some formulative data here. So the trends report focuses on 4 key categories every year. The first category is that of community. We believe that community should always be talked about first, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And there's a couple of ways that we look at community throughout here, and I'm just going to share a couple of things that we've learned from our analysis on community. But one way that we factor community and segment community is based off of collegiate program game offerings. And a couple of things that are of to note here is that we are now starting to stack year-over-year data in our reports. You can see how the data changes over time. And while there are definitely a number of macro trends that we've observed, such as the decline of Hearthstone, the decline of certain types of games, the longevity of certain FPS titles in what we would call the tier 2 category of scholastic esports, the resistance of CSGO and other titles that are similar to that. But you can also really see how developer impact has really shaped what esports program game offering has been. For example, Halo is a really sharp contrast with the launch of Halo back in 2021-22, and then also how it has turned out in 23 with the lack of really developer support behind the scholastic side. Otherwise, we can also take a look at League of Legends, which prior at one point was the most popular game title to be offered within esports programs. It is now the 5th most popular game title out of the top 3, out of the top 4, and it occupies what we would call the 5th slot on what we would call a tier 1 game offering. The other part of community that we first want to talk about before we dive into students and populations of players is we want to talk about the leadership and participation within these communities, within esports programs, um, 86% of all esports directors, we'll just go out here and say it right away, are FTE positions right now. That is an all-time high based on what data we've collected, but that also means that the 14% are in some way, shape, or form part-time or stipend or unpaid in some way, shape, or form. More than half of student workers are paid, which is great. We love that statistic. The statistic that we're really looking for improvement year over year is that only 8% of coaches are full time employed within various institutions. Um, Something that anecdotally may ring true to a lot of people who see that. Nevertheless, a stark contrast to where there are almost as many esports professors and other what I would call tertiary roles to esports programs that are developing out as there are full-time coaches. A very interesting statistic that we should all think about collectively as we are asking for budgetary changes or looking at the lifespan of our program. We'll take a look at the next slide, please. All right, so talking a little bit more about community and how esports programs identify community. We previously talked about some numbers about market TAMs, uh, which are anticipated market sizes. What we know is the average competitive to total student involvement within esports programs is about 64% of that student markup within esports programs are competitive. That obviously has quite a degree of variance. So when you look at national distributions, the average in this case is probably the most fair representation, but also we're showcasing that the variance is very much not linear within participation of competitive student population versus total student population in programs. The variance is much different for clubs. We don't focus on clubs in that way. As many of you will know, that's a totally different conversation, but we do touch on it a little bit. What I really want to talk about is the left side here, which has been a real growing trend, talking about how esports programs define their own community and what are they doing for their community. Because many people will acknowledge here that what we do in the world we live in is not build it and they will come. It is build it and work for it and recruit for it and promote it, and then some will come. Nevertheless, years and years ago, when we were really in our infantile stages, the competition was the focus of programs, and it was the majority of what programs did and what their missions were. Even though almost half of all programs live under athletics today, only 17% of programs exclusively focus on competition, which means that the worldview that we have of esports being electronic sports in so far as it pertains to Scholastic is totally changing. And as we have conversations on social media about esports degree programs and certification programs and education programs and things like that that are often controversial, the reality is that 1 in 3 programs today are having some conversation in some level about academic integration and the benefits of esports in the classroom and the benefits of esports in the job market. And the majority of these programs are focusing on job readiness and they're focusing on skill development. And they're also starting to focus more on general student activities. And this is really important because this may be, depending on how these programs live departmentally, we would understand that that's not necessarily in your scope creep of what your department may stand for. As, for example, athletic departments don't really have much say in academic integration or general campus student activities, but nevertheless, this is a thing. And this is observed and this is a trend. And so we really want to emphasize that the idea of what our communities and impact and mission statements of esports programs are today is more diverse and more widespread and more complicated than ever before. We can no longer think about this as just competition. But of course, that's what we're going to talk about. So let's move on to the next slide. Um, a really important finding that we have always tertially touched on every year is the schools and clubs versus programs conversation. On the left, we have one of the largest ever student initiative events was ever put together by CAG, the Association of Gamers at University of California, Irvine, prior to their programmatic debut with Mark Deppe in 2015. We also have, one of the titans of competitive in gaming, Northwood Esports, on our right. There's a huge difference between the two of these organizations, philosophically, how they work, how they're structured, how they're funded, how they compete, and how they operate. One thing that we have now noticed, and this is no longer an outlier statistic, this has been observed year over year for now 3 years running, which may be alarming to some, is that the increase in stability and longevity and support of programs is correspondingly decreasing the output and average activity and size of esports clubs. And again, this is esports and gaming, and esports and gaming typically lives in the club realm. So when we look at that TAM of 55 students on campus identify as gamers, most of them will find a home in a club, not a program. But as programs get bigger and better, so to speak, we're finding that clubs are becoming smaller and less active. Why? We don't have all of the answers, but our best educated guess actually goes back to one of the first slides of data that we showed, which was the distribution of how programs are staffed. And that supposition and hypothesis is that students that would otherwise enter the college ecosystem and be a leader in their club, someone who's motivated, someone who's driven, someone who cares enough to pick up that mantle of leadership and grow something with it, they would much rather join a program. They'd much rather get the scholarship. They'd much rather be a paid student worker. They'd much rather be a competitor on a team. And the programs are naturally attracting that leadership, either passively or actively. And that leadership is not giving its full otherwise attention that has historically been given to clubs, leading to actually a decline of clubs, not in a quantity per se of the clubs, but a quantity of the active students, because that core team that has historically existed year over year now exists in a different form and function in a programmatic atmosphere, and the two are not one to one. And so that's our hypothesis, and we'll look to see how that develops over time. But that is a massive red flag for our ecosystem as a whole when we look at long-term scale, because we just highlighted the TAM, we just highlighted the numbers. If there is a TAM of over 2 million students that can be a part of our world, but there's only 120,000 that are part of our world, we need to cross those numbers somehow. And that also goes back to the change in mission statement of programs. If programs are going to pick up that mantle more heavily, then you'll see greater success, or you'll see a reversion back to the mean. Otherwise, there are more conversations that need to be had for sure. Let's move on to the next slide and let you all marinate on that one for a second.
Just gotta love that stream delay. Sorry.
You're totally fine. It gives me a chance to think.
Yeah.
So every year we also talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this year we make no difference. I do also want to give it a shout out here, in particular to Cora Kennedy, that for 2 years running has not only, in some point for last year, been an actual author in what we have done and published, but this year has also been a really strong voice advocate and analyst for us, taking into account really the ecosystem as a whole and perspectives that we may not have. And I think that's really important to highlight and call out before we talk about this. The net of what we're looking at is that DEI, there's a lot of work to be done for sure. But DEI also expands beyond the realm of what's your gender and what is your skin color. And so I want to talk about a couple of DEI categories that should be celebrated because they are wins in our space. And those are DEI as pertains to non-binary and LGBTQ populations. Esports programs as a whole have a almost outlier level of participation within those groups or people who identify in those groups, which suggests that gaming and esports as a whole is a safe space for these groups. And as such, under programmatic safety and building of safe spaces that are not only physical but communal, we're seeing a higher participation in those categories than what the campus averages are. So that's really great to talk about. Also, we're seeing similar amounts within populations of students with disabilities, whether those are physical or whether those are learning or whether those are mental or developmental. All of them are valid. And esports and gaming is a safe space for those students within those groups as well, and are natural attractors of students from that category. Additionally, first generation students are also adversely participatory within esports programs, to the point where all of these things are things that should be celebrated and should be talked about more and should be highlighted more, and those stories should be told more. They're currently not, but I think they should, because we can talk about what I would call the improvement opportunities. We need more women taking on frontal leadership roles in the space. We need to elevate more women to where they can be comfortable taking those leadership roles in the space. We need more competitors in the space. All of those are true. But we should also celebrate the wins that we are collectively working on as well, which I think is a beautiful thing. So go team. Go team. Let's move on to the next slide.
Yay. I love seeing that slide.
So talking about community, there's a couple of adjacent things that we survey and discuss between directors and ask how they're considerate of these things. The first is collaboration with local high schools or groups of high schools, i.e. state high school organizations, nonprofits, etc. And the really, really, really great news here is that the vast majority, over 90% of all programs now in 2023, 2024, have relationships with high schools, whether they're national, local, or regional. Fantastic. And that adds value to everything that we do, because we look at our programs or programs in general as islands or bubbles within a greater fractured landscape. But what it really is, it's more like an archipelago, if anything, where there's lots of smaller islands that are connected around it. Just kind of thinking about, the maps of Europe for a second, just how many little islands and cool places there are that are discoverable. It's the same thing with what we're doing in high schools, because we're making those impacts on a macro level and a micro level at this point, which is fantastic. This should be celebrated. It also gives us a ton of leverage within our own community. And additionally, that leverage is then utilized increasingly towards supporting third-party groups, for example, high school students, in the form of engagement activities such as summer camps. And we really love these, not only because they're great revenue drivers for programs, but they're also great recruiting vehicles that are authentic and endemic. And they're also great ways of engaging a campus population that exists outside of your core user demographic in ways that will create longevity and perpetuity within that core user demographic by bringing on new people, showing them just honestly what you're doing. And it's lovely, and we really support all that. So good job to everybody for having our worlds be larger than just that of esports Twitter and competition. This is great. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so there's a million more things to talk about as it pertains to community. We can leave those for questions, and I see there's a lot so far in the chat. If you have a question, drop it in the chat, and we'll address it in the Q&A side of things. So let's carry on and keep moving on forward here, so we have that time for Q&A. Long story short, almost a little over 9 out of 10 programs have a facility now at this point. This is great. It's growing year over year, every year. For this programs that don't have a facility, over half of them are currently building a facility. That's great. And where esports facilities are located this is an interesting one because we already said that just around half of programs, about 44%, live under athletics. Only 9% of their facility spaces are in an athletics complex. Very interesting, but by and large, they're all in student union buildings, or they're a standalone building, or they're a classroom building, or um, we just like knowing where they live, right? So let's move on to the next. We've set the stage, so to speak. All right, so let's jump into the meat and potatoes of what constitutes a facility here. Um, the majority the majority distribution of data is that the average facility is 1,500 square feet or less. It hasn't changed year over year, although it's getting much closer to the 15 to 3,000 level. And where in years past the 0 to 10 ratio of PCs was actually really low, it's or really high. It's gotten much lower now, which is fantastic. Um, the average distribution of PCs and or consoles in a facility now is actually closer to about 15 to 25, which is great. And the average facility has 1 to 3 consoles in it now, which is also great. Um, and as a declaration, Esports Foundry does own a software management platform called Metactics. No one can pronounce its name. I get it wrong half the time, but nevertheless, we do own one. So just declaring that. About a third of all programs use a gaming management software of some kind. Not everyone needs it, but for some they may, some they may not. Interestingly enough, for a lot of people who live under the IT umbrella that say, oh, we need to have some form of assurance, or we need to have some form of management capability. What will these students do when they're playing games at 10 p.m. on a Friday? We have to do something. No, only a third do it. Let's move on to the next. So
I
we're about to
just
talk about some money.
I just call it the Esports Foundry software.
I love that. That's pronounceable. I appreciate that. Um, so let's talk about some money stats. This is all talked about way more in depth in the full report. But I'm doing something we've never done before. So you all are the first public group that get to see this. So feel free to screenshot it or whatever, send it to your boss or whatever. Um, let's talk about some global data statistics. This is based on extrapolated data, which is measured against not only the sample size distribution to the anticipated whole distribution, and then multiplied against the running average of facilities or programs that have facilities. There's a lot of math behind this. Just trying to give some transparency behind it on how we're getting to these numbers. However, we think we figured it out. So for the first time in 4 years, I can say this. In our industry, the total initial spend on an esports facility on campus is between 96 and 128 million dollars. And that median initial spend is $175,000. If you take $175,000 and you multiply it by 750, and then you multiply it by 0.92, you get 120.7 million. So that median number really verifies and validates the above number. And we give ourselves plenty of wiggle room to be wrong here. The other number that we want to look at is the improvement spend. And that is the amount of money that is spent annually on improvements, which largely are equipment, largely procurement, happens every 3 years. And we can estimate, based on this year's and last year's data, what the total run is. And this is a little more variable because this number is going to be high every couple of years. And this really tracks to age of programs, which the current age of programs is 3 years or older at this point. And that ties to IT refresh rates on PCs, which run every 3 to 5 years based on the warranty. So this number may look really higher, and you may be like, why are there not more multi-million-dollar facilities? Well, it's mostly build out, and it's mostly FF&E, and it's mostly computer updates. But nevertheless, What this also means is that we're a $250 million market for companies like Esports Foundry that like to come out and service and help build and help maintain and help outfit and procure for a lot of these organizations on a university level. And that gives a lot of credence and validity to those third party groups that have really slogged it out over these years, thinking that this is a business model. It absolutely is. There's absolutely an opportunity there. So, for the sake of time, let's keep going on.
Pretty pictures.
So let's talk about some of the big facilities that debuted in 2023 or were announced in 2023. I would be really remiss if I didn't talk about and celebrate my man, Chase Newcomb, every time that I can. St. Cloud State opened their facility this year. Michigan State had their massive Alienware renovation that happened this year or this past year. Texas A&M University approved but didn't announce until 2024, but they approved it in 2023. So the top right is a Macy's that may or may not become an esports facility for one of the largest campuses in college esports. Students, not administrators, but students went out and secured $1.5 million to build a new esports center. We love that. Other flagship facilities have been renovated and updated. I'm looking at Boise State right there in the bottom right. And I won't disclose the bottom middle one, but it's really cool because there's a Buffalo Wild Wings in there. And we really, really found that to be incredible. All of this is 2023, which is a very, 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 very exciting. And 2024 will be even bigger. And it's been always even bigger year over year. So let's keep moving on. All right, so let's talk about monies. Monies is a very delicate conversation. Let's before we take a look at the numbers that are on the screen and go into it, let's give a declaration here. The sample size this year was 121 schools that filled out the survey, which represents about 12 to 16% of the national distribution here. So basically, 1 in every 8 schools filled out the survey. But that doesn't mean 1 in every 8 that one of 8 that filled it out aren't the same population every year. And so this year, I will admit we had some schools that were considered flagship that did not fill out the survey that may have directors with higher salaries that are not part of my data set. And I can't ethically include their data if it's not part of my data set, even if I know they exist. So that is my asterisk explanation for the bottom right number as to why it has gone down year over year. But I will say the median range reported for salaries is 50 to 55,000 for a director. And that's just as valid as the average. Both statements are true. I think in this case, the median is more worth celebrating, but the average still is true because esports is bigger than Twitter and not every program is massive. What I will say is that almost half of program directors are getting raises. Most of these are your typical state mandated 2 to 3% cost of living index raises, but nevertheless, most people are getting raises. The predominant raise that people get are when they currently job hop, where we see people coming in from what I would consider D2 or lower, smaller universities into those Division I job postings that become available. That's really the best way to raise your salary if you are a career director or a minded career director in the space right now. What I will also say is that budgets are going up year over year, which is fantastic. And they're not, $1 million athletic budgets that, some of us may wish we had. But nevertheless, the fact that they're currently averaging around just around 6 figures to $250,000 range is fantastic. We can move on from there to the next slide. So let's talk about what you're spending your money on. You're making money, you're spending your money. How are you doing that? So, first thing we want to talk about is conference and league dues, a very controversial topic. A lot of people have a lot of thoughts on this topic. I'm just going to show you the data. I'm not going to make any statements. On the right here, however, we really love, on behalf of esports gear, merchandise, and apparel, keep spending your money. We love that. No, seriously, culturally, it's really important that we're spending that and that we're supporting that, and it's really great that so many programs are supporting that so that their students don't have to for themselves. Half of programs are spending money on recruitment services, which is, in my opinion, really great. We're also seeing a lot of money being spent on professional association dues and service fees and subscriptions. And that suggests that a lot of directors are now kind of coming into the rest of their world. They're traveling to events. Well, a lot of people are going to PAXs now, or they're going to DreamHacks now, or they're going to various different associations. I saw a couple of really, really wonderful faces that all made it out to the NACAD, or they're going out to other places. Those are important, and they're really important because it's really the best way for us to have in-person conversations. So this is a good thing. We're also seeing kind of a maintenance of what is still a minority for sure, but marketing, PR, media and creative, consulting, procurement, those are all um, happening, but not on a large scale. What didn't make the cut because it was so low is actually coaching services, and that was interesting. We did not expect that because I said only 8% of coaches are full time employed right now within the industry. You would expect that there would be some type of coaching service or some type of coaching business or some kind of service that people would pay for to get that service for their students. No, it's not even worth mentioning. It's such a it's I think there's an opportunity there if an organization wants to try to do it right, but currently doesn't exist. Let's go. All right, so let's talk about sponsorships next. The first statement is a really declarative one here. The fact of the matter is, college esports programs do a terrible job at finding their own sponsorships. This could be a little controversial, and it could be viewed as a hot take, but the data doesn't lie. Um, College programs do a terrible job at selling their own programs to third-party brands for sponsorships, partnerships, etc. I don't know why that is, but I would assume it's because it's not their job, and B, there's another department of the university that gets mad at them when they try to do that. But also, the reverse of this is there's currently a lot of hate in the ecosystem towards organizations that raise their hand and say, "Hey, we can help." And the word grifter is thrown around a lot more probably than we should, because those organizations are producing results and they are selling six-figure sponsorships. And in fact, a non-zero number of the largest donations and sponsorships that college esports programs have gotten over the past few years came from third parties doing the legwork, not from the directors serendipitously having the best contacts or anything like that. Your contact list really doesn't matter because the data proves that it's not great. $5,000 does not move the needle when we need to raise our budgets from 100,000 to quarter million. Um, and it certainly doesn't help us, schools send out students to, say, a CECC or I don't know if they're going to have it in person, but an Overwatch Collegiate League finals. If anyone knows if that's happening, let me know. But travel is expensive. And so we really need to, get more money coming in if our budgets aren't increasing at the rate at which we need it to. So food for thought. Let's move on to the next slide. All righty, another declarative statement. Ooh, we get to hear this one for the first time too. Um, so let this number sink in for a second as we all look at the screen together. Less than two-thirds of programs give out scholarships. People think it may be larger. There are a number of discords. There's a number of conversations on Twitter that if you don't offer scholarships, you're not a real program. That's just not true. That literally writes off hundreds of programs from the conversation and excludes them from what should otherwise be an equitable and inclusive conversation on participation, mission statement, and what the ethos is and the worthwhileness of their program are, quite frankly. For those that do offer scholarships, it ranges both on spectrums. It's weighted both towards the outlier categories more so than a middle ground. But the average scholarship distributed is really, really high. The total amount of scholarship distributed in 2023 for the academic year of 23-24, from the fall and spring, $46 million. That's within a single digit margin of error. Instead of giving a range, we're going on this one. And this is corroborated by some third party recruitment platforms that also have their own internal tracking of scholarship data. And so we really feel confident in that number. 46 million is the amount that was distributed last year. That's a double digit increase from the year prior, or at least the range from what we anticipated was the year prior. Also, $100,000 is the average scholarship distribution, heavily skewed, of course, by the top competitive programs that are shelling out tons of money. And let's all not forget that how a private school handles scholarship and how a public school handles scholarship are two totally different spectrums. And we have to take the data at the face value at which the directors give us that data. Because a school with a tuition of $10,000 giving $2,000 is just as impactful as a school that's tuition is $30,000 giving you a $10,000 write-off. And so we just need to keep those things in mind as we look at these large numbers and not get too FOMO'd or not too upset if our situation is not indicative of what you're seeing on the screen. So let's move on to the next. All right, here is one of my favorite slides. We're going to really boil down competition to one slide because to me, you guys talk about competition enough as it is. I don't need to add my own voice to this conversation. But what I will say is that this current season that started in the fall of 23 is the most competitive season year to date. And what I mean by that is there are more tournaments, more leagues, more conferences, more lands, more invitationals, and more pop-ups than ever before. This is a great thing for students. This is a really frustrating thing for directors, and it is hair-pullingly frustrating for operators. There have been more conflicts, more reschedules, more all sorts of things. One only needs to look at what Activision Blizzard announced this week or weekend to have an inkling of just where we're at right now. What I will say is that we'd also do a thermometer poll every year as to what are people's top 3 anticipated forms of competition, what are they looking forward to the most, and then what are they enjoying the most during that same time. And what we see is that the data year over year is actually fairly similar. But what is really interesting to me is the 2023 enjoyed category for developer-backed leagues and competitions. The anticipation of enjoyment versus the actual enjoyment has fallen more than any other category across the board. In fact, it is the greatest agent of change besides tournaments organized by a college or university, which was blank last year because I didn't ask that question. And I think that has something to say, but it's not my role to say those things. But I think that there's reason for why that is probably the biggest area of change that we have observed within competition within our ecosystem. Everything else is, in my opinion, par for the course. Things that are heavily enjoyed are intramural competition, not intramural competition, invitational competition. People love national competitions. They love regional competitions. They really want to feel either like they are a superstar in a big pond, or they want to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, or they want to know who the other fish in that pond are. All of those are valid, and those are the most popular things, quite frankly. Um, and they're that way for a reason. Um, to the point where I think maybe unless things change, developer back leagues are going to get lower and lower. Which unfortunately, if I were a developer looking at this data, I would question my investment as opposed to turn it around and want to invest more. Which is, I'm not sure if that's the impact we want to make with this data, but we will talk to every developer and we will have that conversation with them to, so at least they are aware of how perceived actions are viewed as reality amongst the community. And that is my last slide, so we can move this on to our conclusion and Q&A. We got about 10 minutes left. Jackie, how much time do we have?
Yeah, we can stick around a little bit past 6. That's fine. No,
Okay,
it's 6
sounds
my
good.
time, so 7 your time. However long we need to.
I'm in the East Coast.
Okay. Okay.
So how do we want to do this? Do we want to read off some questions to me that are important to you, or does anyone within the esports and coffee community have a pressing question before we go down through Twitch chat?
I haven't seen any come through.
All right.
And I think just going down the list, I was going to go back on your slides too, just because some people have trickled in, so they might not have seen it. So,
Absolutely. Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to address top questions as I see them chronologically in Twitch chat. So starting out with, I believe, Coach Antor. How does the full report outline definitive statements were gathered or calculated? Yes, it does do that. Our sample size is 121, so n equals 121. For people who are math nerds and really curious about our data, we can supply the y equals calculations for a lot of our calculus and math. And how we do some comparative data is we use multi-year um, data sets to pull upon like data because the questions are repeated year over year. Some are added, but none are detracted. Um, and that's how we're able to pull. So we pull regression, we pull variance, we pull p-value, we pull z-score, we pull coefficient, we pull mean, median, mode, and then we also pull exacts to where we can. And then we can also run regressions against other data. So we actually have a full backend scripted through Python backend in which we can literally, like how you would do in Google Trends, we can actually compare any piece of data from any year against the most recent year, which is really cool. And we can do that for as many categories as we want. The next question is, how do you come up with 2 million student reach? This is a really good question. Our TAM for what we define as the collegiate market total for esports and gaming is 2 million. We get that by taking our data, which came from the University of Central Florida and University of Kentucky, across national data performed by UCF, and then internal data that was pulled by UK and published. We apply that 55% number to the total number of on-campus college students in North America today. And then we multiply that by the distribution of esports programs that exist on colleges with on-college campuses against the national total of colleges that have on-campus populations of students. And that number gets to you to 2 million and some change. The size of our data set was 121. How did you define esports director by their job title or job responsibilities? That's another question. We define it by their job title, and we let the recipients of the survey answer these questions for themselves. We all know that the responsibilities within our worlds vary too greatly, and so we don't want to get hung up on responsibilities because this would be far more fractured than what it is otherwise. Let's take a look at any other questions that are coming down the line here.
I saw a couple more. Just trying to scroll down.
Yeah, I'm trying to find some. Sponsorship include our sponsorships, including donations and alumni contributions. Um, we have a separate set of data for donations and fundraising. Um, Broadly speaking, we break what I would call fundraising into a category that I call PAS, PAS. It stands for partnerships, alliances, and sponsorships. Um, Fundraising through alumni donations is different from a sponsorship. A sponsorship is defined as a contractual agreement that is predicated by the institution and a third party entity in which an exchange of goods and or services are provided. Um, Usually that goods and or services involves money. So for this, we're tracking exact dollar data of monies that are changed hands within these sponsorships. We are not tracking in kind um, provision. So a HyperX sponsorship where they give you 25 headsets for your LAN doesn't count unless HyperX gave you $5,000. To be clear, those two things are very different because the way there's the business world of that ecosystem works would be wildly skewed if otherwise. Dylan and Uconnect would be the chief of sponsorships and be distributing millions of dollars, and everyone else would be, in the six figures or lower. But shout out to Dylan for sure. Um, Other questions?
This one is for scholarships. It says, is this average per student or per program? And this
I
was
would certainly hope that it's for program. If the average student was getting $100,000, that would be crazy, bro. Um, but in all seriousness, this is programmatic distributions. We're asking programs, how much money did you distribute? And we also do want to keep in mind that schools do not run one bill per year, they run semesterly or quarterly. Um, so we do want to take that into consideration, that this is not, $100,000 distributed per semester. It is a total distributed over a period of time.
what
We have a,
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
What would you feel would be the number one thing for esports programs to work based on your data?
The number one thing for esports programs to work on based on my data is if we go back to slide 8 and we talk about the community conversation of clubs versus programs. The biggest thing that we need to work on here is community. So if we go back 2 slides to slide 5, where we're looking at those numbers of the TAM of where we're at. Thank you. Um, what our data suggests is that there are 2 million students in the United States and Canada that can, should, and have a reason to be interested in what we are doing for students as initiatives, as clubs, as programs, etc. The reality is that we are so far from it. And many people in this chat here today that are either part of clubs, part of programs, leading one, leading the other, anecdotally, many of you see this to be true, where you may tell your administrator, oh, we have 1,000 people in Discord. How many people show up? 50. How many people are active? 30. How many of those are a clique of a core group of people that will leave and graduate together? X%. We need to do much, much better at elevating these numbers through inclusivity. And that's a DEI conversation, but that's also an engagement conversation. That's a conversation in which people need to feel like they are invested, they are a part of, they are contributory, they have agency. And the delicate conversation to have, if we go back to that schools versus clubs picture, is that agency is naturally taken away from students that exist on campuses where there's an esports program by nature of the director having agency. And that relationship that the students used to have no longer exists and cannot exist. And so it's very important for us to think about collectively, how are we engaging in the conversations of agency, and how are we distributing agency to our population so that they feel invested to want to grow. Because there's a difference between active growth and following growth. And I think that is a huge thing that we need to focus on over the next few years, more so than competition, more so than governing body, more so than league dues, more so than anything else. Because if this doesn't work, the population of everything else goes down. If this works, viewership goes up, monetization goes up, competition goes up, commercialization goes up, because no one has to lie about those numbers anymore, which is a really strong way to end that statement. But I really, truly believe that to be true.
I think you're on the right path. I think that statement is 100% accurate.
Yeah. So Kyberts had a question about facilities, which is what percentage of it is used for non-esports stuff. And we actually do have an answer for that, Kyberts. It's not in this presentation that I've prepared for you, but nevertheless, I do have this answer for you, and I am going to pull it up for you on my screen, and I'll let you know. So right off the bat, academic integration within esports facilities is really important for a conversation because of the average size of facilities. If a facility is over 2,500 square feet, which is the average size of a classroom on campus, then it warrants to say that the average size of stations is also 25 or higher, which is in line with the average size of a classroom on a national basis, which means that it's eligible for academic integration. Right now, only 13% of programs have taught a full course using their esports facility, which is a great way to activate the space between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock on an average day. Um, but furthermore, universally, 38% of esports facilities are only accessible to esports program students. And that could be by default with key card access, or there are other ways, maglock, etc. Um, but only 14% of facilities are open to all campus students. Only 14%. Um, I think that number could be higher, but until the average size of facilities correlatively increases as well to make that conversation worth having, it will continue on the track at which it is. So we're currently on a time gated problem based on refresh rates of hardware, which is when capital expenditures become eligible, typically. And we're also time gated on available space. The problem is once the initiative is checked off and the shiny thing is done, administrators are less likely to opt in for new space to be used for esports because they have another shiny thing that they're chasing. So it's kind of an uphill battle, which means recruitment numbers and participation numbers are really important, which again goes back to that 55% number that we're chasing towards. Without the right data, we can't advocate for our own self improvement.
I'm gonna bring us back. Yay! It worked. My transitions. Um, I think there's one more question, but I think that question would be really good answered off screen in like a one-on-one conversation or having a group chat.
Oh, that is my alma mater at Cincinnati. Go Bearcats! We love that. That's fantastic. Um, yeah, we can have that conversation offline for sure. Send me a DM and we can chat about it. I hope you guys are doing well, and I really love what Queen City Clash has turned into. So go Cats!
Not that I
Beat
don't want
Miami.
you to answer it on screen. I just think there be question after question and having a more in-depth conversation would be good.
Sounds good.
I want to thank you again for letting us host you to present the trends in esports. I think I have this right. This is where you can purchase it when it's out on their website. And again, you think that's going to be out this week?
We're hoping so. If all goes well, it should be out by Friday of this week. If not, it'll be out over the weekend or early next week. But nevertheless, you can always find all the most up to date information on our Twitter at Esports Foundry, or you can follow myself at WBB Chris. or my wife, Mrs. Lucifer, because she will most likely be retweeting when it comes out, so you can see it from her as well. Fingers crossed. I'm making a promise for her. I'm not sure if I should do that or not, but I love you, babe.
Just do it from her phone. I'm sure a lot of us will also retweet it. I know I'm going to purchase it. Again, I just want to thank you for coming, and thanks everyone for hopping in and answering all the questions that people had. Any last thoughts before we head out?
No, I would just say thank you so much, Jackie, for having me on. I think Esports and Coffee is an incredible organization, an award-winning organization, if I'm not mistaken. And the impact that you guys have here in the community that you've built is really fantastic. So I just wanted to say thank you for hearing my voice, and I hope that my voice can be helpful to all of yours, and that collectively we can make ourselves 1% better every day.
I like that. 1% better every day. And it will. Well, we're going to do a little wave, and we're out of coffee, even though I don't have anything. So thanks, everyone.